So for many of you, Professor Paul Ewart's not going to need an introduction, but for the rest of you, so he's an emeritus professor and former head of atomic and laser physics at Oxford University, where he was also a tutor and fellow at Worcester College. His fields of research have been in quantum and nonlinear optics, laser physics, and their applications in chemistry, remote sensing, and engineering. He's worked at Imperial College and held posts in USA, France, and New Zealand. And he is currently director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, and he is also the executive chair of Christians in Science, who's brought us here today. I have had the pleasure of being lectured by Professor Ewart in the past, and I'm excited that you now get that pleasure too. So welcome, Professor Ewart.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Tavinda. But just one correction. I'm now the ex-director of the Faraday Institute.
Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Can't keep up with these things. It just happened a few weeks ago. Anyway, thank you for staying all day to listen to this lecture. And I think I really, apart from saying thank you for staying, but owe you a bit of an explanation. You're probably expecting at this point in the program to have another lecture from a distinguished A-level speaker. And the committee who was organising did their best, you know, to go through a list of the top names in science and religion to fill this slot. And to cut a long story short, we got to a point where we needed to get somebody to do it because all the other stars were actually already committed. So I'm not saying I'm on that list, I wasn't at all, but at least I was going to be here. So this is why I'm here and not one of our more distinguished speakers. So I just wanted to ask you, mentally as it were, and rhetorically, if you can see in the title here an intentional double meaning or an intentional ambiguity, faith in science. There are two ways in which we can actually take this, and perhaps the subtitle, Does Science Succeed and Faith Fail, give you some kind of pointer to what lies behind this. But I'm actually going to talk about both senses of this title. The first one is that faith in science could mean that faith is some part of science. It plays a role in science, and that's obviously a contentious statement because there are many of our colleagues, especially our atheist colleagues, who would just deny that faith is any place at all in science, that science deals with facts, with evidence, with logical thought, whereas faith is a leap in the dark, a tendency to just take things on trust rather than based on experiment or evidence. So that faith in science could mean that faith is some integral part of science, has some role to play in science. Or it could mean we can actually put faith in science. We can have faith in science in the sense of trusting it as something in which we can base our lives and our decision-making processes. So both these senses, I think, are worth exploring, especially in the context of today's commemoration of Professor Donald MacKay, because one of the issues that he dealt with was this issue of what we call scientism. That is the idea that science is really the only thing that we can trust. And so what I want to address here is, does this trust in science justify the philosophy of scientism? And Professor MacKay, in many of his apologetic books, really addressed this worldview of scientism and gave it a solid critique. I want to reflect on some of those ideas this afternoon. So, we've got two parts to this talk. The first one is to, as it were, lay the background, in a sense, a more positive take on faith in science, and then we can address this question of scientism more directly. So let's return to this first idea that faith has a part in science. And the antagonist will, of course, someone like Richard Dawkins would say that nonsense, because faith is in fact the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and to evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, or even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So in other words, the very antithesis of the scientific method. So, That's the view of a very well-known scientist, but let me counter that with what I think is the view of an equally, perhaps even more famous scientist worthy of respect, and that is none other than Max Planck, the originator of quantum mechanics. And he wrote this: "Anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the Temple of Science are written the words, 'Ye must have faith.'" So, clearly, a scientist of the caliber of Planck thought that faith had a part to play in science. But what, in fact, might he have meant by that? Well, I think that if we cast our minds back, if we can, as it were, to ancient times and think about how people looked at the world around them, they would have seen largely a world of chaos, of random events, of things that were unpredictable. There were obviously some orderly things. The sun rose and set every day, but life was perilous, and people were subject to random events. And people in those days were not so much interested in how these things happened, but why they were happening. And they would have interpreted them in terms of the gods playing with humanity or the world around. And the gods that they had a sense were behind the world were capricious. One thinks of classical terms, the gods of the Greeks and Romans were kind of superhuman beings that acted capriciously in the affairs of men and women. Here we have a statue of Zeus carrying a human captive back to Olympus to have his way with her. So these were the kind of things that, jumping ahead here, that the worldview of the pagan world, if you like, had of the gods behind the world, that the events of their lives were subject to the capriciousness of the gods. And that's in contradistinction to the God of the Bible. The Hebrew worldview saw the God of the Bible as someone who created the world for a purpose, and he created human beings in his own image as objects of his love. And that's why he blessed them and gave them charge of the world that he had created. But more than that, he imbued them with the sense that they were loved and came in human form himself to show that love for humanity. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. So this God that the Hebrews believed in not only was behind the world, but was prepared to come into the world to experience it as humans did. So that being the case, on the one hand we have a worldview that sees events as arising from the caprice of the gods. In that case, there's really no point in trying to understand it in some kind of rational way, because anything could happen. There's no incentive to look for any order in events or the operation of the world. On the other hand, if the world was the creation of a loving, rational God, then perhaps there was order to be found there, even amongst the apparent randomness of the world around. And that was one of the things that grew out of medieval philosophy, as people thought about the world in terms of this biblical worldview, that sense could be made of things. One thinks of people like Nicholas of Cusa, who argued that it was actually more sensible of God to have the world rotate rather than having the whole universe rotate around the world. It'd just be more efficient. And so it's a kind of orderly way of thinking about things. It made sense of the world to think of God making an orderly world in that way. We move on then to the times of Johannes Kepler, who thought of his science in these terms, that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God and which he has revealed to us in the language of mathematics. So for Kepler, his object, his motivation was to see the order that he believed to be there, to be discovered. And therefore having that faith in that created order motivated his science. So this faith in fact led to the science that we have today. So it's no accident that modern science grew up from this Christian culture with a biblical worldview. And not only that, but the methods of science were brought into play because the world was seen as the created being of God. It wasn't a God itself, and therefore it could be experimented upon. And so Bacon, the father of experimental science, came up with this, I think, very quotable quote that as you get deeper into science and study it, then at first a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion. So that the practice of science, experimentation of defining empirical data, motivated by this search for order, in fact, once you got deep into it, began to raise questions, profound questions that pointed to the existence of God and his character, so that the science itself began to point back towards faith that had originated it. And we see things as science has developed. Up to the present day, we have developed very detailed descriptions of the order in the world, from the very tiny ones that we've just seen in Zachary's lecture on the evolution of tiny organisms up into larger life forms. And that comes out, as he was pointing out, in a universe that was fine-tuned for life, and that it's now well known that there are so many apparently unconnected coincidences that had to be just right for life to appear in its present form. And that it seems to be just too much of a coincidence. That if you have one improbability, well, so much. Have another one, okay, that's even more improbable. But if you multiply probabilities, you soon get to very large improbabilities indeed, because they're cumulative. One of the things that always tickled me was, as a physicist, to realize that in this universe fine-tuned for life, of course, life as we know it is based on the atom carbon, but there's actually more carbon in the universe than the natural laws would lead you to expect. There is, in fact, an anomalous abundance of carbon in the universe, in the way that elements are formed in the heart of stars. One would expect a certain spread in the abundance of the different elements. And it turns out that carbon is formed by the simultaneous collision of 3 helium atoms. Now, colliding atoms happen all the time, of course, but you have to have these 3 atoms collide simultaneously in a very small time and space interval. And that's very improbable, and it's not insufficient to explain the present abundance, unless it turns out that the fundamental forces between the nuclei, the electrical and fundamental nuclear forces, are such that there is a resonance, that the probability of this happening is actually enhanced, and therefore when these three things happen, the probability of them sticking is enhanced. And this was worked out by Fred Hoyle, who was actually an atheist who believed in the steady state theory of the universe. He didn't like the idea of the universe having any beginning. It sounded too much a bit like religion. But nonetheless, objectively, he says this: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, in this case the physics of forming the carbon atom. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. And this from an atheist who had no religious motivation at all for saying this. So let's go back then to what Frank might have made of that statement. I think he would obviously have agreed with it from the point of view of a sense of the faith that he had in a creator God. He said that all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force, and we must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. So here again we see the science is pointing backwards to a faith in a God who created the orderliness that science discovers and tries to interpret. And of course this resonates, does it not, with the Christian view that ultimately the order in the world arises from its origin in God, and that the rationality of the laws that we can discover using our minds also relates to the mind of God, that we have something in common with him, being made in his image, and that therefore we can make sense of the world that he has made. And this is put, I think, beautifully by the Apostle John. He writes at the beginning of his gospel, you'll remember, in the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word, Logos, was with God, and the Word, Logos, was God, logos being the Greek word for word. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And for the Greeks, logos was the underlying rational principle that governed existence itself and how things behaved. So this is entirely consistent with the biblical worldview and the scientific worldview, that there is an order there to be discovered. So the conclusion of the first part of our talk is that, in fact, faith in the Creator has in fact led to modern science. So there is faith in science in the sense of it being a precursor. And also when we get into the science itself, we find evidence there that points back to the mind behind it. So that faith is intimately involved with science. It's both its precursor and it's also confirmed by the evidence that science uncovers. So we can accept this interpretation of faith in science in this way with good intellectual credentials. But let's take the second meaning. We can trust science to tell us the truth, therefore we can put our faith in science. But for some people's perspective, the science tells us that we're nothing but atoms and molecules. When we get right down to it, every explanation in reductionist terms ends up with atoms and molecules, or if you keep going further down, protons and neutrons, or even quarks, brains, if you want to go even further, strings and so on. So ultimately there's some fundamental inanimate object that sums up who we are. We're nothing but atoms and molecules. And more than that, we're here only because of the chance production out of a purposeless process. And this is really the summary of what scientism is, that it explains everything away other than what science can discover. And that science will answer all the questions we need to know the answers to, and that other questions that arise that apparently science can't answer are therefore non-questions and meaningless in some sense, because at the end of the day, we're just stuff, if I might use that technical term again. So, what we want to say here, that scientism is making this claim that science succeeds and faith fails, really, to give us the proper, true, ultimate explanation of things. If we look at what might be described as the crowning glory of modern physics, the description it gives of the universe in terms of the Big Bang, it tells the story of this initial singularity 13.5 billion years ago, followed by rapid inflation, and then the formation of the first massive particles, and protons and neutrons and electrons, and then stars, and then ultimately galaxies, as we've seen in Zachary's talk as well, the operation of these natural laws of gravitation and so on, leading us to the universe we observe today. So we have now quite a comprehensive picture of how the world and the universe has come into being, and we think we understand a fair bit of it. And this struck the famous physicist Steven Weinberg, one of the originators of the Standard Model of fundamental physics, that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. So he's made that step from having a scientific explanation in material terms to this metaphysical conclusion that there's no point to it at all. That in the end, we are just the products, the byproducts, as it were, of this cosmic process. And this kind of thinking has really permeated modern culture today. I came across this quote from an artist, poet and writer, David Jones: "We're nothing but space dust trying to find its way back to the stars." In other words, we're nothing but atoms and molecules. This is the ultimate scientism reductionist model of who we are. And this is what Donald MacKay took exception to and gave a solid critique of in a number of places. We've already seen this book mentioned already, The Open Mind, in which he uses this analogy, a slightly different one from the fire escape sign one, of coming in to seeing a blackboard covered with equations and diagrams. And people give an explanation of this as it's just nothing but chalk on a board. And of course, which misses the point of what the meaning of those equations might be. Now, don't worry and think about what are those equations meaning, because they actually don't mean anything. I just made them up. Okay. But one can imagine the idea. We have a representation of mathematical relationships, what Kepler might have said, the language of God, describing some feature of the universe around us. But all some people would see is just chalk on a board. And that, in a sense, misses the point. To say that this is nothing but is really to miss the point, and is what Donald MacKay called the fallacy of nothing buttery. And of course, that is not just a view that one can take from a Christian perspective, but actually is echoed, or not quite echoed, actually preempted by an atheist, J.B.S. Haldane, who wrote this about 1927 or so. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, in other words, if we're just atoms and molecules, then everything about us, even our thoughts, are just what atoms and molecules are doing. If that's the case, then I have no reason to suppose my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason to suppose my brain to be composed of atoms. So he realized he was, as a materialist, cutting off the branch he was sitting on, that there was an inherent contradiction in that worldview of materialism. And of course, the problem runs deeper than that, of course, as well, from a logical point of view. One can use the analogy, if you like, of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Now, Gödel wrote this theorem in terms of mathematical logic as an example, as it were, of a closed logical system, in which he was able to show conclusively that some statements can be made within that mathematical or logical system that may be true, but cannot be proved from within that system. One needs something outside that system, a transcendent level at which to validate that statement and prove that it to be true. So that's, in other words, we need something outside the system to validate it. Now, here's the problem for scientism, of course, that for the believer in scientism, there is nothing outside the material world, outside the natural system, and therefore there's nothing ultimately that can validate our rationality. Our rationality itself is simply the product of the motion of atoms and molecules in our brains, and therefore it can't be trusted. So that's another illustration, if you like, of the limitations of the scientific method and of the materialist worldview. And I always remember, many of you might be of the same generation as me, and certainly of Professor MacKay would have perhaps recognized George Burns and Gracie Allen, who had this comedy show on American television that we often saw sometimes on BBC. And at the end of each show, George and Gracie would come onto the stage, and George would have a chat with Gracie, and one time Gracie said that her nephew was doing some scientific research. And George would sort of suck on his guitar and say, well, Gracie, that's very interesting. What's he researching? So Gracie said, well, he's trying to find out how many people in California have a telephone. Well, that's a very interesting problem, said George. Well, what did he find? So Gracie said, it was 100%. George said, that's amazing. So how did he discover that 100% of people in California had a telephone? Well, said Gracie, everyone he phoned up had one. So, of course, that's a fallacy, of course, and a problem that we as scientists have to address when we design an experiment, that we mustn't build into the results, build into our method of finding results in advance, so that we're limited only by what that method can do. But it does tell us that science can tell us only what the scientific method can tell us, and there may well be issues and questions that that method will not be able to resolve. So science fails to answer questions such as meaning or purpose in life. But for the scientist, for the believer in scientism, of course, those are meaningless questions. But they have to say that, as it were, as a matter of faith, because there's no way they could demonstrate that. Now, we move on then to the other issue, that even if we set aside the issue of whether we're just atoms and molecules, we are here just as a result of an unfeeling random process, expressed, as we've heard already, by Jacques Monod in his book Chance and Necessity, that man at last knows he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he has emerged by chance. And of course we all know what he means by that. There's no meaning or purpose to our lives, and there's no mind behind the universe, and no ultimate meaning to any of it. We're just atoms and molecules, and that nature that we see around us is simply a mixture of chaos and order, of chance and necessity. But of course, another way of looking at it, and Joel Polkinghorne pointed this out, is that both chaos and order can be seen as integral parts of a created order of God, because both chaos or randomness and necessity play important roles within nature. In Polkinghorne's terms, too little chaos and nothing gets created, and too much chaos and nothing survives. So as it were, there's a role for chaos in creating the variations that we've seen in how evolution works and so on, for one example. But if there's too much, then anything that is created in that process doesn't survive for too long. And therefore we need some order to maintain the novelty that's created. In Polkinghorne's terms, chance is the engine of novelty, and necessity is the preserver of fruitfulness. I like to see that as another aspect of the fine-tuning of the universe. There's just the right amount of randomness present to free us from determinism, and to give our minds the freedom to think objectively without being totally determined how we will decide what to do. And so that randomness frees the universe up, not just nature but ourselves, from the iron grip of determinism. Of course, the worry for some of our Christian brothers and sisters is that if we give too much power, as it were, to chaos or randomness, it would seem that God would be no longer in control of things. But that's not necessarily the case. And one doesn't have to go totally to the fully open theistic view to recognize that, as John Sanders put it, that even if there are random processes occurring, they're still within the providence of God, and that God has the love, wisdom, and perseverance and power to deal with any situation that arises as he carries out his creational project. Now, that has generated a lot of theological fuss, as it were, and controversy. But nonetheless, this was, in a sense, addressed by Donald MacKay, who else, of course, in this little book, Science, Chance and Providence, that's also been referred to today in his Riddle Memorial Lectures, when he takes issue with this issue of chance. What's all the theological fuss about, he says. He takes the view that whether we as scientists would classify an event as chance or physically determine it, as the opposite, is of no concern whatever to the biblical writers, who would coolly assure us that God gives being to all events in both categories, and that he is sovereign equally over either category. And I think I would agree with that. I'm not sure I would completely go the whole way with Professor MacKay in terms of how he sees the operation of chance as God sees it, without becoming tied up with the issue of determinism again, that if things are determined by God in some way, even dynamically, then what effect does that have on our freedom of choice? MacKay's view of it is that we experience random events in time because they are things that we can't predict ahead of time. They are things that seem to be unconnected to what has gone before, and therefore our experience is tied to our time dimension. But God sees things outside of time, and therefore is not bound in that same way. Something we may discuss in the panel session as how whether or not, even if you outside of time, if a God who can see all time simultaneously, what will happen to us in our time dimension, does that determine what happens for us? Are we still free to choose, even if ultimately it has to turn out the way God has designed it? Discuss. I think we're getting to the limits of our rationality, perhaps, and I think this is recognized also by none other than Einstein. He said this, that the human mind is unable to conceive of 4 dimensions, 3 space and 1 time. So how can it conceive of a God for whom 1,000 years and 1,000 dimensions are as one? So we do have a genuine problem here of how we can see things as God sees them, as Einstein wants to see the electron. How can we understand fully this whole problem of predictability, chaos, randomness, chance that Professor MacKay addressed in one way, perhaps as from his Calvinist background. I'm not sure, I don't know well enough what his theological position was on that, but certainly he presents a position in which everything is determined ultimately by God. But he also presents a picture of a dynamic situation where God maintains our world in a dynamic state that would appear random to us in one way, but is maintained by God's constant interaction with it. And I think I can understand partly of that in the sense that that creates that possibility of us having real choices in life, moral responsibility and decisions that we make freely, and that God can respond to whatever we decide to do within the laws of limitations. But God is above that and can interact with us in a dynamic way, and that generates the possibility of us having a real relationship of trust and faith. But if it's difficult for us to really understand that, how can we ever really know God if God's so beyond our experience and our dimensions? Well, that's, if you like, one of the issues of apologetics. How do we explain our faith to the unbeliever around us? And something which was very much of an issue in Professor MacKay's mind from his writings. So that we look in the world around us, we may take it that what we see there, the orderliness of it, is an indicator that behind it is this mind of God. But what do we know about that God? It could be any kind of God. It's a bit like we go to a party and we see an attractive member of the opposite sex, or perhaps the same sex, and we want to get to know them. And just looking at their appearance will tell us some things about them. But unless that person in conversation is willing to open themselves up to us, to reveal something of themselves, we can't really have a relationship. And of course, one only gets into that kind of relationship once we make some level of commitment of trust, that step of faith. And so faith then opens up the possibility of more knowledge, more understanding of things that even may be beyond our ability to fully understand. And here we have the glory of the gospel, because God has revealed something of himself, not just in the world around us, but ultimately through faith in Jesus Christ, we can come into that personal relationship with God, that we find this new way of knowing through faith. And so that brings me to the conclusion of our second part, that science has its limits, that science does not logically demand scientism, that it's not logically determined, and ultimately scientism itself is logically self-defeating. And clearly, answers to some questions must go beyond science. To find some of the answers, we might approach things in a different way, beyond the scientific methods. And one of those is that step of faith and trust in God in such a way that he will open himself to us. So that faith is that way to another type of knowing. So, faith in science. Does science succeed and faith fail? Well, I think the answer that I'm trying to put to here is that faith and science together will succeed, because they both provide answers to different types of questions, but they are consistent with one another. They give us a coherent and fuller picture of reality. We find also that scientism itself fails because it's ultimately self-defeating. But in that case, faith succeeds where scientism fails on the big question, in the meaning of life, why we're here, is there a God, and can we know him? And these are the questions, of course, that we have to deal with in relating our faith to the people around us, our family, our friends, our colleagues at work. And it's one of the issues that Professor MacKay took seriously in terms of our calling as Christians in science in the field of apologetics. Because he recognized, as we all do when we have these conversations with people, that there are genuine intellectual objections and difficulties that people have. I had my own as a young Christian, and we have to work through them. And we have to understand that for people who have not made that step of faith, sometimes these intellectual doubts and questions are insuperable, and they seem reluctant to take that step without having some help in dealing with those intellectual problems. But the criticism is often made by believers that, well, that's not your problem really, you just don't want to believe. And that you're using these intellectual doubts as an excuse not to believe, or running to science as a way of avoiding the question, or saying it doesn't matter. And I think, as Stuart Judge was saying earlier, that should not be our approach to react to that in an aggressive way, but in an understanding and gracious way, to know that many of us have been there with those doubts and those questions. And sometimes I think of my own role as a teacher and as a tutor, and some of my students get to a problem in a theory or a proof of something, and they just can't make that next step. They can't see how to make that logical step, because they don't quite understand what happens next. And I say to them, well, just let's go around that and take the next step after that, and then we'll go back. And sometimes that works. If you say, well, okay, well, let's assume we can do that. And then you find the proof, and then go back, that's why we had to make that step. And so sometimes we can encourage our friends who are struggling with intellectual questions in that way, to say that, in fact, we can take that step of faith and find it is a coherent and rational thing to do. And that some things will only be discovered when we've made that step, and that in my experience, in our experience, it is justified, and that we have found it to be real in our own lives. And so, not that we give up this intellectual discussion and argument, but that we understand it from the other person's point of view and do our best to explain it. So I'm going to leave the last word to Professor MacKay in this field, as I encourage all of us to take these questions seriously, to think them through as far as we can, and be prepared to discuss them if in fact they are problems for our unbelieving brothers and sisters. He said this: honest intellectual argument, seeking to do full justice to fact and to identify fallacy wherever it lies, is ideally a service to God whom Christians claim to worship. Thank you.
Any questions for Professor Ewart? Go to you first.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a wonderful talk, Paul. I just wanted to ask a question about what you were saying about randomness, determinism, and chaos. I guess perhaps the simplest way I can put it is, are you talking here about an epistemic determinism or randomness, stochasticity, or are you talking about an ontological one? So thinking about it, it's coming from a mathematical perspective, and similarly as a physicist, you could describe a system using deterministic equations, ordinary or partial differential equations, and those might give rise to chaotic behaviour, although it's still deterministic. Or you could describe the same system using stochastic equations, whatever form you want to take. That doesn't necessarily say anything about whether the system is at base stochastic or deterministic. It's just you can describe it usefully one way or the other. So in what you're talking about here, are you discussing an ontological, in the way it is in and of itself, a kind of determinism or stochasticity? Or are you talking about an epistemic stochasticity in terms of the way it's useful to think about it or understand it?
Okay, so the question is, there are two types of chance, essentially. Epistemic chance, which is one where we can't predict the future because we don't know enough about the situation, and therefore we can't predict what's going to happen next. But in principle we could, because what's going to happen is deterministic and has been determined up to that point in time by all the factors that will determine what happens next. The fact that we can't predict it means that for us it's a matter of chance, and that's what we call epistemic chance, a matter of our knowledge of the situation. And that describes a lot of phenomena like chaos theory that treats weather patterns and so on, that we believe are deterministic, but so complex that it's difficult for us to know the initial conditions with sufficient accuracy to make an accurate prediction. So that's epistemic chance, if you like. There is the other type, which is one might call pure chance or ontological chance, which was that even if we knew everything about the situation, we still wouldn't be able to predict what's going to happen next, because it has no cause, or at least no apparent cause. And there may be an important distinction there, of course. But let's say that ontological chance does exist, that there's no real cause, it just happens. Would that kind of chance have a place in God's creation? I think most classical theologians would say no. I think a lot of present-day theologians would say no. Some open theologians would say definitely yes. And I think I am somewhere in the middle there. I think there is a place for genuinely non-deterministic processes, uncaused processes that are genuinely free and random. I think that's important, because otherwise, ultimately I don't believe we have free will. Something must break that deterministic cycle in order to free us to make a valid moral choice for which we can be held responsible. And I think that also applies to Donald MacKay's view of God's outside time determining things, that although it looks indeterminate for us, is determined by God. And I think there is a theological fuss to be had there that we might discuss. I am prepared to see God's sovereignty in a different way from classically, where, to put it in R.C. Sproul's term, there's not a single maverick molecule in the universe, that everything is controlled by God. I'm not sure that's either necessary or honoring to God, that I think God's sovereignty could allow a certain degree of total randomness, because he can cope with whatever happens. And I use the analogy that William James uses in explaining free will, that of a novice chess player playing against a chess grandmaster, an infinitely wise grandmaster, so that I'm playing him or her, and I can make any move I like within the laws of the game, of course. Nothing's totally free. So I can make any choice of my moves. Whatever I do, the infinite master is going to win, because he can adapt his interaction with the game to take account of whatever I do. So I see that as a bigger God, if you like, than the God who has it all mapped out, has only one game in town, as it were, that he can play an infinite number of games of chess at once, if you like. And I think that's a greater vision of God, God's sovereignty, that he allows that degree of freedom, not just for us, but to his nature, his world. And he is in a dynamic relationship with it. And that's what MacKay speaks of, maintaining a dynamic equilibrium in the world. And I think the two things can fit together. So yes, I believe there is ontological chance. And I don't think I'm too much of a Christian heretic to say that.
We've got time for one more question, and then the rest can maybe go to the panel. I'll come up to you.
Yeah, excellent. We're getting into philosophy, I think, Paul. I don't see that evolution, the universe points towards a loving God. I do think it's very possible to explain, I'm coming from a rationalist point of view here, a deistic God. There's got to be a prime mover beginning. I think also second law of thermodynamics, entropy will always increase, so we end up with a meaningless universe according to those laws. So I struggle with that, I mean purely from a rational point of view, a human rational point of view. I do believe in a metaphysic. I'm thinking of St. Paul on Mars Hill talking to the Athenians, and clearly we're all under Plato and Aristotle to some degree. They listened to him, unknown God, very interested. So lots of gods there. Where they scoffed at him, and he didn't have a good conversion rate, there is no letter to the Athenians, was very much when you start talking about the afterlife, spiritual things in a pure sense, not sort of here's an image of a God, which I would class as metaphysics, which I'm very interested in. I think as Christians we all should be. My real question is there a demarcation between where science leaves off and what I call metaphysics, you can call it spiritual world? Is there a demarcation you can define in any sort of meaningful terms? And is that a variable as science progresses, as we know more about the universe? I imagine you've thought about this. I'm very interested to say that sort of demarcation where we cross over to what we do not know and cannot know. Do you think there are things science will never know about, but we may have some faith in? So it's a deep question, but it does concern me, because as all of us who believe in an afterlife would say, yeah, we're very interested in these things. And I don't have a scientific explanation or a rational one. I just have a faith through the incarnation that is the case, you know. Sorry, it's a long question, but it's really the demarcation between science and physics and metaphysics, if you like.
Okay, I hope you'll be happy with a short answer. Which could be, I don't know. But what I'd first of all say is that I'm quite content with the idea that there will be ultimately questions that science will never be able to answer about the universe, even about stuff. Because the way things are going so far, we need more and more energy, you know, to get smaller and smaller length scales. And so the next stages are going to need an accelerator that's the size of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun or something like that. And it'll be, in practice, impossible. There'll be a practical limit to the resolution that we can get of the universe at certain length scales. So there's a limit to what we'll know ultimately in that sense. But I think the more important question is that we're not really interested here in what scientific questions science will be limited to answering. Because I think we'll be more concerned with more urgent matters like climate change and how to keep life existing on this planet before we worry about those big scientific questions. There are questions that we ought to be addressing here and now in scientific terms. But what I want to say is that there's a different kind of question, not a question that has a limit in practice, but has a limit in principle that science can't answer. And questions of the afterlife are of that nature. And I think I would simply say to your friend, if we're having that discussion, this is just the nature of things, and that just as science has to take the world the way it is, that we have to take electrons as sometimes being here or not there and waver a particle, we have to find a way of describing that, even if we don't fully understand it. We have to take the way the world is. And the way the world is that there's stuff that we can touch and feel and prod and experiment on, but there are other aspects of the world that do not appear to be made of stuff in that way. And it's in that area, that metaphysical realm, that science really can't help us. And therefore we've got to use different methods. And I'm suggesting here that one of those methods is faith. For example, science will not tell you whether you will make a success of a friendship. If by doing that you have to examine it at every stage and test everything your friend says before you do anything, it'd be a different kind of relationship if it wasn't based on trust. And so that kind of experience of life is one which is not done wholly on the scientific method. Of course, we learn by our friend's actions what kind of person he or she is, but it's a two-way dynamic relationship. It has to be based on that thing we call faith or trust, and that opens up more knowledge that wouldn't be gained had we not made that step. And so those kind of questions in that, if you call it metaphysical or spiritual realm, need to be approached in that way. Just as within science, we take the appropriate approach to measuring what we're trying to measure. And we approach questions of life and meaning and purpose in the same way. If we find that in a relationship, we find it even more so in a relationship with God.
Thank you very much for your talk and questions, Paul.